And we are back for another live stream. Hopefully you enjoyed joining us last week for the live stream. If you didn't get a chance to watch it or didn't get a chance to join us at the time, head on over to the channel. It's up there. The replay is up there. Go check it out. There's some great questions we answered at the end, and how these are sort of going to go over the next little while, as I was explaining last week, is we're going to jump on Wednesday morning Melbourne time, so Australian Eastern Daylight Time at the moment. Talk about a little bit of a topic. So we've got one up today, which is obviously what the thumbnail was showing. So we're going to be talking about how to manage some of the travel considerations when you have to travel to compete. I've got a number of athletes who are doing that at the moment, whether that be for 70.3 World Champs in Utah, but also I actually did a bit of travel myself over the weekend to compete. So I wanted to take you through some thoughts and some ideas around how you can best manage that. But then we'll jump into a couple of questions that popped up on the channel over the last little while. So if you're joining us live, chuck your questions in the chat. Will, great to see you back in the chat as well. Really appreciate people jumping on this morning and joining in the conversation. So let's kick things off with, first and foremost, what's the most important thing when it comes to traveling for your race or traveling for your event, competition, sport, whatever it might be? When we need to go from one location to another, what are some of the most important considerations to make sure that we can still optimize performance, but ultimately so we can manage some of those considerations so we can get there and just have a good time more than anything? Because travel can be quite a stressful thing. And that's probably the first thing, is make sure you've got a really clear, solid plan in place, because having backup plans and secondary ideas is going to eliminate the stress out of things that are unpredictable. So for me personally, over the weekend, I have all my travel looked after for me, which is great through the AFL. But ultimately, when I got there, they didn't have a rental car ready, and I needed to be able to get to my accommodation. It was starting to get late. And it's one of those things that as much as you can eliminate the stress, so I just went along with it and went, you know what, I can't really do too much about this, but there is a plan in place of how I'm going to get there. And there's a plan in place, there's a backup plan of how I'm going to get some food later on to cover off dinner. I had all of those steps already worked out in my mind, so I could just relax a lot more, and it wasn't stressful. You could definitely tell there were people around me who were getting stressed about their own situation. So making sure you've got a nice clear plan in place, you got some backups, and you just stay as calm as you can throughout the situation, is a really simple but effective tool to be able to make sure you can mentally prepare then for what you have to do, which might be to compete or to perform once you get there. Outside of that, more of the common things we then talk about are things like the time zone difference. So classic example, athletes from Melbourne who are heading over to 70.3 World Champs in Utah, big time zone difference going on between where they are here and where they are there. I had an athlete who went through a number of different time zones to get to St. George, Utah. But ultimately, when we are traveling, and I discussed this in a previous video when I was talking about, I put up the other week about why Kona is difficult. Part of it is the acclimatization period, but also changing time zones for athletes. And if you're getting to the place early, that's ideal because it gives you more time to adjust. When it's short term, so something like Utah, for a lot of those athletes, are heading over a week in advance. They've got a bit of time to adjust, maybe even more time, something for Kona, similar for Kona as well. For WA on the weekend, for me, I was flying in on the Friday night. So I left Melbourne Friday night. My game was on Saturday, and then I had to fly back Sunday. So it's a much quicker turnaround. And this is where you've got a couple of options here, depending on the length or the duration you're actually going to be in your location. So ultimately, the first option is if it's really short term, like mine was, essentially just a weekend, the time zone difference between Melbourne and Perth is 3 hours. So Perth is 3 hours behind Melbourne. So going over, you actually gain some time of the day. So I left at, I think, 4:30 p.m. And arrived at just after, what is it, 5:30. It's because of the time zone difference, I only actually lost an hour. What I decided to do was stay on Melbourne time for the majority of, or as best I could, stay on Melbourne time. So it meant when I got there, by the time I got in, I had something to eat, I went straight to bed. But then I ultimately woke up really, really early in the morning at, say, 5 a.m. local time, which was actually 8 a.m. back home. So I tried to keep on the same time zone, which then allowed me to just get into the game and then ultimately get back to Melbourne and feel reasonably good after not having really transitioned back. Because coming back is probably the worst part from the weekend. Was I left at 9:30 in the morning Perth time. I landed back in Melbourne after a 3-hour and 10-minute flight at about 4 p.m. So that's where the shift can really throw you about. Coming back, obviously, then if you're a bit tired, get through the day, get through the last little bit of the afternoon, go to sleep, that's okay. But it is still a draining process when you're traveling that long. On the flip side, though, what I discussed with some of my athletes who are heading over to the US is to get on the local time zone early. So rather than staying on your home time zone, it's going to be too difficult. And at some point, we do need to be on local time from a racing perspective, and we've got the time to adjust. So what I suggest is, as they're flying over, is to get onto that local time as early as they can. So what that means is, for one of my clients, had a couple of layovers in some different spots, had to go from Melbourne to Sydney via Fiji to LA, and then was traveling on from there. What we discussed about doing was trying to keep ourselves, taking a later flight out, but trying to keep ourselves awake on that flight a little bit longer into the evening. So having the dinner service and then waiting a little bit longer into the evening to get any sleep on the plane, to really push it out, have a couple of hours of sleep, get a decent block in, wake up, and then as they were coming into, as they were going to be landing into the US, into Los Angeles, that's where we would just try and stay awake during the majority of the day period. They're ending up going to be landing, usually from a Australia to US perspective, it ends up being, if you leave late night here, you arrive mid-morning on the same day. So because we're crossing the dateline, we're going backwards. Getting to stay up as best you can throughout the day. Don't have to do a hell of a lot, but just try and keep yourself awake. Get through dinner, get through an hour or two after, and then go to bed. It's a really good way to reset you onto the time zone. So we're just adjusting the system backwards, forwards onto the time zone that we're heading to, but doing that in advance of actually getting there allows you to basically hit the pillow as soon as you're ready to for that first night of sleep, and that can really accelerate that process of getting onto time zone. So there are a couple of really key important parts around travel and changing time zones, which is quite often the case unless you're traveling within the same time zone. That's obviously where it's a bit different. But some other last little things, and more so for when we're on planes and on long haul flights, etc., to manage are things like hydration. Really, really perfect environment for dehydration is the inside of a plane or the cabin of a plane. Well air conditioned. You're not up and about and moving. You've got good airflow if you turn the vents on. What that means is ultimately you end up with a scenario where you don't feel like you maybe need to drink as much as you normally would because maybe you're not sweating or feeling the effect of heat. You're not maybe talking to many people, so your mouth isn't getting dry. All of these factors, really easy for an athlete to dehydrate, and that can really compound if you go to somewhere that is really high in heat or humidity. If you're dehydrated on the way there, it's very difficult to get back on track. So making sure we are really well hydrated throughout the travel portion, but then ultimately when we do get there, continue to hydrate along the way to make sure we're not putting ourselves at too much of a disadvantage leading into the event. Just give me 2 seconds here. I've just got my chat coming up. Perfect. All right. So outside of that, another couple of things to look at from a plane situation and being on the plane is wearing things like compression. Gets talked about a lot in terms of should be wearing compression or maybe recommended, but the reason why is because we want to promote circulation, particularly for athletes who more so coming back from travel. If you're traveling the day after your race, which I know is quite common for a lot of athletes, particularly if you're racing within your own country, you might have to come back straight away. What that means is that we might be a little bit dehydrated, which means there's a little less blood flow, and the stationary position or sedentary position in the plane doesn't allow us to get that blood moving because we're not necessarily up and about walking around as much. So wearing something like compression can be really useful. I wear compression on pretty much all flights post event, so to speak. So when I go and have football interstate, even if it's only a short flight, like an hour, like to Sydney, I'll wear compression there. I wore compression to and from Perth. I wear the socks. If you want to wear the full tights, I've done that as well, but my socks are a little bit tighter than what my tights are at the moment. So I prefer using those, and it's a little bit more manageable just to roll them back down once you get off. But it's the type of thing we want to promote circulation as best we can. because not only it's a really good from a health perspective, but also particularly if we are a bit fatigued coming home, we're already in that process of trying to continue some blood flow to help speed up some recovery for when we get back. What it also does is it reduces some of the swelling and inflammation that goes on from being seated. We get venous pooling happening, blood pooling down in the ankles and the feet. That swelling can cause some discomfort throughout the flight. If we can minimize that a little bit, that's going to be ideal. But following up from that is, as soon as we get off, what I try and do is get walking as quickly as we can. So as soon as you're able to get off the plane, that's where we start to, you need to start walking around a bit and do a bit of walking before you then have to sit down again. Ideally, try and find somewhere where we can just walk up and back to try and get that blood flow happening to eliminate some of that that swelling in the feet or the venous pooling going on. Is going to accelerate not only recovery, but ultimately it's going to help us out in the preparation to perform. So a little thing that I typically do is where we normally would park at the airport for our short-term flights at the airport parking, I just park at the slightly further away car park. What it means is it forces me when I get home, I get off the plane and I have to walk a little bit further. And usually I'm going to walk a little bit quicker because I want to get there, but that helps circulate some of the blood flow. So in essence, it's actually helping me to be able to get some of that happening post-flight. Last little thing that I really want to touch on is probably back on the time zone side of things as well, is a bit of that sleep management. Knowing when to sleep and when not to sleep is really important. And that's set up by, are you going to stay on local time, or are you going to stay on are you going to get to local time quicker, or are you going to stay on your home time zone the entire way through, depending on what's going on? And really important to understand that first, because that's going to play into, well, do I need to provide myself some considerations for sleeping on the plane? Like, what am I going to be more comfortable wearing to try and sleep? Am I going to be too hot, too cold? Do I need to bring an extra jumper, even though I'm going to a hot location? Do I need to wear a jumper on the plane to try and keep myself a bit warmer, to make myself more comfortable or more conducive to be able to sleep? Do I need to bring a neck pillow, or do I need to bring my own pillow for the hotel? Like, all of these things are really important considerations when it comes to sleep. But your sleep management is really, really critical. We still want to make sure that across the 24-hour period that we're going through, we are getting appropriate amount of sleep. And for athletes, it's a little bit more than the typical. So the typical recommendation of 8 hours is great for the general population. But as athletes, we train and we do a lot more, and we require more recovery, which means ultimately we're going to need probably closer to 9.5 at least. So that's a really important part of it as well, that really feeds into what are we doing with our time zone management, is really going to play into our sleep management as well. So there's some ideas and some thoughts around some travel considerations. Let me know in the comments down below. What do you do when you travel, whether it be a short-term travel like I did just for a weekend and back, and we're playing with time zones, or ultimately longer haul travel going international to race? What are some of the key considerations you make? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments down below. But otherwise, what we're going to do to wrap that one up, we're going to head into some of the questions that popped up on the channel. But before I do, I just wanted to quickly throw this one up on the screen, which is the thumbnail of what you can expect of the new video going up this week. It's another Coffee Thoughts. Coffee Thoughts is back. And what we're discussing in this one is there an optimal training intensity distribution? That's what TID means there. Optimal training intensity distribution. Does it exist? Find out in that video. It's coming very, very soon. Hopefully going to go up on the channel tomorrow or Friday Melbourne time. So that's going to be the next day or two. Look forward to see that one. Jump on it, check it out, leave your comments and questions and get involved in the discussion over there. Again, with Coffee Thoughts, not right or wrong. We're mainly just talking about an idea. And I had a really interesting set of discussions with some athletes recently about that topic, and I thought it'd be a good one to share with you. So jump on that. That one's going to be going up very, very soon. But without any further ado, let's jump into the questions. So if you are in the chat, chuck your questions in the chat box. Let me know what you're thinking. I've got a couple already from the channel, from some previous videos that I get through first. But if you do have your questions, fire them away in the chat box. More than happy to see if we can answer them here on the live. So first question I've got, so going back through some videos, I found this one. It was a really interesting question, and I think it's a common one that I get regarding VO2 max. And absolute and relative. It comes from Max. He says, I've done some lab testing cycling wise, and his absolute VO2 saw an increase from 3.9 litres per minute to 4.1 litres per minute. So an increase of a couple of hundred mil. And the relative VO2 max reduced. So if you haven't seen this on the channel before, haven't seen these terms before, absolute is the total amount of oxygen we can take in, transport, and utilize in terms of liters per minute or milliliters per minute. Relative is like our power to weight ratio. It's mils per kilo per minute. So we take our 4,100 milliliters per minute that Max has got here, divide it by his body weight in kilograms, and it came out to be 60.4 mils per kilo per minute, whereas previously at a lower absolute, he had a VO2 max, a relative VO2 max of 61.6. So we have this interesting relationship going on here. He says over that 3-month period between tests, he gained 2 kilos in that time, and he was wondering what that meant. Would the increase in absolute be as a result of positive training adaptation, and is the decrease in relative purely just the body weight factor? What are we sort of talking about here? So great question, Max, and ultimately he's spot on there. So like we said, absolute VO2 max is just how much oxygen you can take in, transport, utilize. The relative is your absolute divided by your body weight in kilograms. So those two factors interact in terms of effectively your fitness level being your absolute and your body weight being the relative component, if you want to think about it really simply like that. So any change in body weight, if we were to stay the same fitness level and we reduced our body weight, relative would go up. Relative VO2 would go up. Even though we're not any fitter and we can't actually use any more oxygen than we could previously, we've got a better power to weight ratio, or watts per kilo for the cyclists out there. It's a similar concept. On the flip side, if we stayed the same fitness and body weight goes down, relative VO2 goes up, body weight goes up, relative VO2 goes down. On the flip side, if we stayed the same body weight, but our absolute VO2 was going up, then relative would go up as well. But if our absolute comes down, relative will go down. What we have is an interesting scenario here where we've got an absolute increase, but our relative decreased. Body weight has outplayed the increase in absolute. So what I mean by that is we've only seen an increase of about 200 mil per minute, which isn't a huge amount. It's enough to maybe show there are some signs of some improvement there, which is great. But what we've seen is that the body weight factor has been a greater contributor to what our relative comes out to be. So he's spot on there in terms of it's purely just being that little bit heavier. So ideal scenario is trying to keep your body weight the same and increasing that absolute to see purely have we improved from a adaptation perspective, being able to use more oxygen in some circumstances is what we're looking for. So that's what we want to see absolute go up. But in more cases than not, for most endurance athletes, if that relative number is going up, it's that combination of a byproduct of body weight improving or decreasing and absolute increasing anyway. So an interesting dynamic there, but it's really important to understand the differences between absolute and relative because they actually tell us a little bit about how our body's changing rather than purely just did we see an increase or decrease in fitness or not. You've got to look at them in context. It's like, yes, we did see some adaptation, but we saw some reduction in relative purely just because you're a couple of kilos heavier. So an interesting discussion point there around relative and absolute VO2 that happened in the comments on a video touching on relative and absolute VO2 and the discussion around what the two terms meant. So thanks, Max, for sending through your question on the channel. Again, continue to leave your questions down below in the comments. If you're watching this on the replay, let me know your thoughts down below or questions you have down below. Happy to answer them. Otherwise, join us in another live stream where you can jump in the chat like Will has done here and asked a question. Let's see if I can bring this up on the screen. Maybe. Here we go. There we go. All right, we've got the chat up on the screen. So Will's asked a question in the live chat. If you are joining us, make sure you jump in and put your questions in there. Just a random question. Hopefully you can help. I was always told to work out MHR, which I'm assuming max heart rate in this situation. It was 220 minus age. Is this accurate or should I be trusting my Garmin instead as it has different readings? Really great question. It's a really common one that we see a lot, particularly when I'm testing athletes in the lab. Max heart rate. To be completely honest, the 220 minus your age doesn't even come from the initial study that sort of led to 220 minus your age had influences of clinical population, so recovering stroke patient and that type of population. And it's a very sort of blanket rule. It's one of those funny things, similar to like 4 millimoles of blood lactate for threshold. It appeared, and all of a sudden we started believing it. So that's where 220 minus your age sometimes works and it sometimes doesn't. So it's a bit bit of a lucky dip if you do fit that characteristic to be able to estimate your maximum heart rate. I see more often than not, more people are outside of that range, whether they're higher or lower. So my typical recommendation for getting a genuine maximum heart rate is get a heart rate monitor that works, and I would be getting a chest strap rather than using your Garmin inbuilt. Wear a chest strap, it's a little bit more accurate, a little bit more reliable, but go out and run warm yourself up, but then go out and run or ride or whatever your sport is. Go as hard as you pretty much can for 4 minutes, 3 to 4 minutes, go flat out until you start to feel yourself fatigue. You're more than likely going to set a pretty close to a maximal heart rate. That's the most effective way of doing it. Literally just go as hard and as far as you can for about a 3 to 4 minute period. That's where you're going to see heart rate really come up there. It's going to be quite fatiguing. You only have to do one effort, but that's what's going to give you a more accurate indication of where can you get your heart rate to. The other alternative is jump on something like a treadmill or an erg and do like a ramp test, a short ramp test. So say every 30 seconds even, increase by a more of an increment. So on the run, you might be doing half K an hour every 30 seconds or 1 K an hour every minute. Ramp yourself up from low intensity all the way up as hard as you can possibly go. That's going to give you a reasonably closer idea of where the ballpark is for maximum heart rate, because maximum heart rate is going to be influenced by things like temperature, how hydrated you are, how much caffeine you've had. All of this is going to be influenced by, or your maximum heart rate is going to be influenced by those characteristics. So ultimately, heart rate will keep going up and up and up as long as there's a demand or driver for it. But you might find that for someone who's 20 years of age, 220 miles your age, comes out 200 beats per minute, you might find you can get your heart rate to 206 beats per minute, or you might find you can only get it to 185 beats per minute. So it's really, really important that you do some form of test to do it. Even with the algorithms of what Garmin suggests, I would still tend to go out there and actually genuinely set that new max heart rate record by doing a short 3 to 4 minute test like that, purely to make sure that we are getting it as accurate as possible, because Garmin will factor in some of their algorithms, will factor in ways to get a little bit more accurate, but I still find that sometimes comparing to lab data and going and testing it, you still find there's a bit of discrepancy there. So really great question. I wouldn't use 220 miles your age. There are much better ways, much easier ways to do it, like going out and doing a 3 to 4 minute flat out effort. But if that's where you're going to start with, make sure that you actually look at your heart rate data and training and then compare it and go, hang on, this isn't right. You'll work it out pretty quick that it's in most cases it's actually not going to be that usable, the old 220 miles your age. But still gets talked about quite a lot. So hopefully one day we don't have to keep referring back to it, because it doesn't really work, particularly for those who are trained and have done or have seen some adaptation over time. That's where it generally doesn't work too well, because we're different to the norm as well. So different population subset, which is going to influence things. So great question. Again, leave your questions in the chat here. We'll be on for the next little bit to answer them. But we've got another couple that are coming through. I'm actually going to quickly jump to one from the channel from before that I had previously prepared, because I know there's just another question that's popped up in the chat as well. So had an interesting one, and this is something that I've covered before on the channel, but Yassine's asked the question. He's interested in sports, but he wants to know exactly what a sports scientist does. Now, I wanted to put this one up because it's an interesting topic in that different sports scientists are probably going to have slightly different opinions on what this means, or what it being a sports scientist means. For mine, it's problem-solving performance. It's working with an athlete directly, or working with an athlete and their coach, answering the questions that they have around training, performance, racing, optimization, whatever it might be, and trying to problem solve that for them. How can we find ways to be better as an athlete? How can we find ways to better prepare that athlete? What are we currently doing? Evaluate it. How can we sort of break it down and improve the process or optimize the process? I really see myself as a problem solver. That's what I like doing, is investigating what's going on and being able to find solutions, and then implementing those solutions as well. So it's not just finding the answers to things and always knowing the answers. More often than not, it's receiving a question or query from an athlete or coach, taking that away, thinking on it, researching it, and then going back to them with with an appropriate strategy to implement, but then not just leaving it there, following that up and then evaluating that strategy to see if it did actually work or where do we have to make some further tweaks. So that's really what I see the general functional role of being a sports scientist is. Others would have different opinions, but purely I think that's how it functions best in the world of endurance sport, is just being able to problem solve things and find solutions and find ways that we can get things done. Particularly as well around the side of things of managing things like training load. Obviously, endurance athletes have quite high training loads, which tend to lead to some different issues and problems in terms of managing that. So that's where the problem solving piece, to be able to how do we fit in swim, bike, and run across the week, some gym sessions, but ultimately still balance that with appropriate recovery to allow those adaptations to occur. That can be quite a difficult thing for a lot of athletes to manage, and that's where a sports scientist can come in and sort of help problem solve through that process, break down race results, etc. So that's really what I see my job as being. So really great question. I know though, like I said, a number of different people have different opinions on what the role might entail, but that's how I've always viewed it, is how can I optimize performance for an athlete, but also how can I answer the questions or problem solve for them along the way. So great question coming through. And again, remember to leave your comments and questions on previous videos, because I might pick some of those up and bring them into the discussion here on the lives. We've got another one coming in around the injury side of things. So been injured for a while, and I'm trying to get back into it is where we're heading here. But starting to suffer from Achilles tendonitis or tendinopathy. Any tips for runners who struggle to keep the kilometers low? This is an interesting one. In terms of how classic of an injury it is for runners, the Achilles tendinopathy, largely this is going to come from load management. So the Achilles type injury, same with patellar tendinopathy or runner's knee, ITB syndrome. These are all classic overuse-based injuries. And when I say overuse, it doesn't necessarily mean excessive kilometre. So we have to keep that in mind. Overuse isn't just, I'm going and running 100 Ks a week. You might receive an overuse injury only running 30 kilometres a week at the beginning. And the reason for that is because it's a mismatch between what our capacity is going to allow us to absorb and withstand versus what we're actually trying to acutely output. So it's this battle of are we actually strong enough to withstand the demands of what we're trying to do? If we're receiving some of these issues, the answer typically is going to be no. So what I understand from this is we've been injured and now we're trying to build back in. And as we're building that, we're starting to get some of this Achilles discomfort and tendinopathy symptom. Why? Because we're probably just starting to build things back probably a little bit too quickly, purely from a running sense. I'm not talking about anything else we're doing outside of it. If you were just running and not doing anything else, I would be saying likely, and I don't know the full detail, and this is a difficult one to answer in this sort of forum because I'd really like to go into more specificity of your specific details. But ultimately, we're probably just building it back that little bit too quickly. And what I suggest as a way of combating that, if you feel like you still want to go out and run a decent amount throughout the week, I would suggest going the more frequent path. So running more frequently throughout the week. And we covered this last week in a similar type of question around building in some training load. Rather than going out and being like, I'm going to run 10K 3 times this week, maybe run 5 or 6 times in the week, but only run 5K at a time and gradually build back that tolerance to the impact load, get the Achilles strong again. Outside of that, you obviously need to be working on your strength and resilience stuff. So that's doing your calf raise work. That's doing some maybe isometrics around your calf raises. So just holding a calf raise position for say 20 or 30 seconds is going to aid in that Achilles strength or Achilles resilience. Things like plyometrics, so some simple single leg little hops and things like that are really, really important. Being able to absorb load, so teaching your Achilles to land and absorb load, which might purely just be standing on one leg, do a little jump off the ground and then just catch yourself really softly on one foot. Something like that can be really good for strengthening, like just a basic way of just strengthening everything up. Make sure your soleus isn't left out of that as well. So what I mean by that is don't just do straight leg calf raises, do bent leg calf raises as well, or from a bent knee position to really target the muscle that actually absorbs most of the load during running. Those things outside of it are really, really important, and absolutely engage in the strength side of things to be able to get yourself strong and resilient and be able to increase the tissue capacity. So when it is under stress when we're running, then it's going to be able to better handle that stress. But at the same time, from a running perspective of building that running back, your point there on any tips for runners who struggle to keep the kilometers low, my tip would be less in each individual run and more runs throughout the week is probably the better strategy to do that, because it doesn't put too much stress on you at that immediate point in time, but then you gain it day in, day out, and you might be able to merge those runs back into less runs in the week and bigger runs in the week down the track once those symptoms start to subside. We just want to make sure that we're not going into big runs. And like, let's say, for example, like when I go back to my example of the 3 10K runs a week, you don't want to go into those and be pushing yourself every time to the 5, 6, 7K mark of that and start to have that symptom, and it starts to get worse and worse as you go. If we're not getting to that point, like we're going to be building resilience if we're not getting to that point in, say, a 4 or 5K run, if that's where we stop it. But if we then come back the next day, like we're still going to get some adaptation. We might have to park a little bit of that aerobic adaptation for a little bit, just while the Achilles gets strong enough. But we're not going to be stressing it so much that we're constantly putting ourselves in when I say a bit of a hole of, we're sort of doing more damage in each of those runs, and then we're trying to recover out of that, and then we feel good again, we run, we damage it again. We're sort of just gradually building some load. So I think that's excuse me. I think that's a really interesting way to look at trying to build your training load back after having some injuries. Think about more frequent, shorter runs during the week. You can always build those back later on. And your second point there, and I'll chuck this up on the screen too. The sort of the follow up to your question is your point on cycling is a good way to, I guess, work in with those shorter runs. So if you're concerned about the aerobic adaptation and just the fundamental aerobic capacity side of things by not doing as long a session, jumping on the bike once or twice a week is a good way to take a bit of pressure off the Achilles in the initial stage. So not running it, reduce the running load, and then add in some cycling is a good way to keep some cardiovascular fitness going and some aerobic side of things going. But then ultimately, at some point in time, we do need to think about transitioning back to building the running load and maybe reducing the cycling. And that's once we're strong enough and have the greater capacity to withstand some of the load through the Achilles and the calf. That's where we can start to build some of that back out as well. So I know that's a little bit vague in sections, but it's the type of thing with these, they can be quite specific. So going through in a little bit more detail, I'm more than happy to chat offline. If you want to catch up on a Zoom or something, we can always arrange that to go through in a bit more detail. But because each specific scenario on what your Achilles is behaving like and when and the context around it is really important. But I think some of those general recommendations there are probably going to serve you well in terms of getting back. Last thing very, very quickly is we want to make sure that we get on top of this. So if there is a bit of a loss in running load in the short term, but it means that longer term you're going to be okay, I'd always rather take that approach rather than the approach of sort of just trying to push through things and it will eventually get better, because it very rarely gets better. So that's where I think we're going to leave it today, because I do have to get to a phone call in not too long, which I got to do a little bit of prep work for. But do appreciate it with us here on the live stream. Again, don't forget about the new video going up, the new Coffee Thoughts video going up in the next couple of days. Keep an eye out for that, talking about training intensity distribution. The live stream replays will go up on the channel immediately after we finish. So if you miss a section or you aren't able to join us on the live, you can always go back and watch it later. So check that out on the channel, and please continue to leave your questions and comments in the comment section of the live stream replay, because I'll go back and have a look at those and be able to answer them, or I'll bring them on the live stream next week. And as I say that, last thing I'll leave you with is we are going to be jumping on Wednesday mornings, Melbourne time, usually about 10 a.m. This morning was a little bit earlier. Like I said, I've got a call coming up in the next little bit that I have to get to. But first thing in the morning, grab yourself a coffee, join us. If it's afternoon or evening in the US, you might still want to grab yourself a coffee. But for those locally in Australia, mornings on Wednesdays, we're going to be jumping on, talking about a topic first as we did, and then finishing off with some live Q&A. So appreciate you all joining us. Look forward to seeing all of you in a video coming up soon. Make sure you get those questions in. Always happy to answer them. But for now, we'll catch you in the next one. Cheers, guys.